because I'm not intimidated, I'm not frightened by any of this, and I am an unavowed follower of El Haj Malik El Shabazz, who was a Pan-Africanist. I don't back up from that. I am a Pan-Africanist because Kwame Ture, also known as Stokely Carmichael, was a Pan-Africanist. And they were both immigrants. And I ain't about to deny their sons or daughters, from my position, reparations. I'm not denying Amadou Diallo. Amadou Diallo was from Guinea. Under the police terror and the war on drugs, they did not ask him whether he was from Guinea or not. Nor did that apply to our brother Abner Louima. Not about to deny Shirley Chisholm. I'm not about to deny Harry Belafonte. Today's descendant today's immigrant is next generation's African American, like the sister,
Nonetheless, I don't think there was adequate discussion. Our time got interrupted to actually do the deliberations that I think were necessary. And so what ended up happening was, lineage-based became the criteria for which the task force will determine who gets reparations.
Reparations should not be limited to the era of enslavement or eligibility, but should not be limited to proof of lineage during the period of eligibility for harms against people of African descent. It must also include U.S. apartheid system and the ongoing systemic racism. The eligibility for harms against people of African descent in the United States was ongoing and very inclusive. Thus, the remedies must be ongoing and inclusive, or we risk extending the injuries instead of repairing them. Thank you.
Let me put it this way. Sometimes, you got to be ready to find what you find when you go looking into family history. Mm-hmm. And, what happens when folks like myself find out about family members who were lynched? Right. That's re-traumatizing. Right. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to say, you have the burden of proving that you are eligible. You run the risk of finding out things that may further traumatize you. Mm-hmm. And you've got to have the wherewithal and the time and energy, even if there is an agency set up to help with this search. Mm-hmm. It takes time. You've got to sit with someone and try to remember and share what you know and pull up things. And who has that, especially our most vulnerable and our hardworking, families that, if I can just get 5 minutes to sit and stare at a wall, I got a good day going. So
pro-white supremacist money.
Wait a minute, hold on, Doc. Hold on. How do you have a group that is advocating for reparations? That group the origins of that group being anti-immigrant and pro-white supremacists.
The backers of ADOS and FBA know that. They want to limit the amount of money that goes to what they call non-American Black folk. And they've been successful in doing this with the creation of ADOS and FBA. I told someone that Faraji, this week, ADOS is very organized. And the reparations movement right now, groups like Cobra and others, are not as organized as they are. Plus, they have the backing of white racist money.
So we need to think about this like a mass tort case with several different buckets of potential recipients, because many people have been harmed. And even if they haven't been harmed at exactly the same level, their harm should be taken into account. We have the harm of the transatlantic slave trade and the Middle Passage. We have the harm of the institution of slavery. We have the harm of the Jim Crow legal segregation. And we have the harm of the post-civil rights apartheid system, which we are currently experiencing now. And anyone who has some proximity to those harms as a person with Black skin needs to be included in the broader class. And then we can narrow it and decide and differentiate in terms of who gets more reparations. But we can't just exclude people who were harmed right off the bat. That's not how it works from a legal perspective.
Well, you kind of were getting into this because this is some of the discussion that was going on in the chat. So what are healthy and non-divisive ways we can address and acknowledge the degrees of harm suffered among Black people in the United States? And are there ways that we can acknowledge that descendants of slaves may have been harmed the most while also acknowledging the harm suffered by Black people who may not fall into that category? And I'm bundling that with another question where a person asked, is someone who immigrated to the United States from Africa 3 years ago qualified for reparations for slavery and Jim Crow?
The top of my head, somebody that came 3 years ago, I'm not so sure. How about somebody that came 80 years ago? And when we say, you know, people are right, people who immigrated here after slavery knew that America had slavery until 1865. Was America being broadcast as an absolutely racist country? Was that the view around the world? And just to stop to think about it, are we essentially saying we're blaming the victim? You came here, so you deserve what you got. You're somehow not a victim because you came here knowing that other people had been victimized.
Questions of race and or lineage have cultural, social, and political definitions that are best addressed by studying how they intersect with, influence, and interact with legal definitions, and also how they function beyond specific legal definitions and broader historical frameworks. Therefore, popular legal notions of race and lineage are inadequate tools for tracing group-based harm.
The language of this statute says African Americans with a special consideration for descendants of people enslaved in the United States. You look at the common parlance. You interpret the language of the statute based on the common understanding of the words. African American, the common understanding of the term African American means Black people, all Black people.
Now, providing reparations only for those who can prove their descendancy from enslaved Africans is yet another win for white supremacy because it dismisses and devalues the harms done to African descendants, not enslaved here, but who were injured by slavery due to their Blackness once they entered the shores of America. And they're injured by the legacies of slavery due to that same Blackness that we as descendants experience. And policies and practices that flow from this anti-Blackness are the legacies of slavery.
You don't draft a piece of legislation that decides these things in advance, because that cuts off the ability of people, the people who came here after slavery. They should have a chance to come here and say, this is why we should be included in this reparations bill. This is how the vestiges of slavery affected my family, even if we weren't enslaved. And other people should be able to say, we understand that, but this is how it's different.
The chat or in the group are going to be very upset with me. We distract ourselves because we make arguments about who should get and who should not get when the crime against African peoples is broad. It goes, as we have said, and you don't have to agree, but the injury from the enslavement of African peoples and the vestiges of African people go beyond just those who are descended from those enslaved. Now, you can argue all day long that they have a separate claim. You can argue all day long that's, they shouldn't be included. My view is that the injury continued after slavery and it got defocused on people who were not enslaved because the injury was tied to your, as someone put in the chat, phenotype.
Black individuals living in the US, including Black immigrants who experience race-related stress, are vulnerable to psychological distress in the form of depressive symptoms, such as feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and worthlessness. As a clinical psychologist, I actually had clients who were African immigrants and who were Caribbean immigrants. And they were struggling under the weight of American racism. They did not understand or know the extent of that racism. I could also go into research that addresses some of the concerns that people have raised about African immigrants don't want to connect with African Americans. There's a whole literature on that with data to support it. And I have to say that the comments that I've heard to date do not reflect that.
Another area, very controversial. I know there was a razor thin majority, a 5-4 majority that came up with a standard for how to gauge eligibility in California for reparations. Can you speak about that and the controversy around that?
Yeah, so that was probably one of the most, how do I put it, the most difficult experiences for me on this task force was that whole discussion or lack thereof on lineage-based strategies as opposed to harm-based strategies.
So, this is not to say that those who wish to discover their ancestry and their lineages, this is not to say that they should not do so. In fact, they should. Everyone should if they choose to, but it should not be mandated as a specific requirement in order to qualify for reparations, settlement. So that's where my issue comes. We're listening to Dr.
But if you think about it, it is not, race is a construction. We are Africans, or we are African descendants. Somebody else is Chinese or Chinese descendant. That kind of thing. Nationality.
In addition to that, my interpretation of AB 3121, using the words in the legislation, is that we must address remedy for enslavement and its legacies. And in those legacies, all Black people are impacted. And I'm going to come back to that with not armchair theory, without a personal experience, but grounded in some data. But let me say first that lineage-based approaches are in fact divisive of a Black community that we need to be united. In addition, it has the potential to exclude folks who have the lineage, and it does not address the greater harms for those folks whose Black skin relegates them to the same forms of racism as those of us who are US-born descendants. Now, I am a descendant of enslaved Africans, and I understand my responsibility to my ancestors, but I also understand the larger picture and the responsibility to a much broader global process that Dr. Carr tried to speak to, that existed and was launched prior to even the definition of what we now call the United States. But now,
by lineage-based, do you mean those who can specifically trace their ancestry back to a particular plantation, or is that essentially what that is?
Yeah, well, that they can provide documentation that suggests they don't have to take it back to the actual plantation, but that they can find a descendant, that they are descendant, and evidence that they are a descendant of someone who was likely enslaved or a free person living in the US prior to the end of the 19th century. So people can pull up somebody in the 1870 census, for example, then that could suffice.
So, on a mass collective basis, how easy or difficult is that? Not on individual basis, but on a mass basis, which is what I think we're talking about with respect to reparations. How easy or hard do you propose that would be?
So if you listen to some of the experts that came in who are genealogists, they left the impression that it's not that hard to do. But the reality is, and I talked with some folks who are part of the African American Genealogical Society, their leadership, and I also talked to the one of the people in the Mormon Church that maintains the best data source for.
So then we got to go to the Mormon Church in order to. I mean, that's kind of.
I'm just saying.
Validate a claim for reparation.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So they make it sound like it's, well, they meaning the experts that came on, that it's not that hard to do, and those who are proponents of the lineage-based approach try to say that it's not that hard to do. I am here to tell you that it is not easy for everyone.
That we live in, and that's why reparations are so important, and to understand it within that construct. And once you understand that race is a construct, and then you start identifying people by nationality, it's really clear, or it gets very clear. I'm not saying anything is easy, but it gets fairly clear who should have reparations, because you can identify the people who have been lumped into this category, not because of who they are, but because of what they look like. And that's the unfortunate or fortunate, however you want to look at it, nature of this. If you're trying to identify what people who are likely entitled to reparations look like, I'm just saying in general, look at four faces on this screen. There are a whole lot more different looks and shades and everything else, but we didn't use that as an identifier. America used that as an identifier. And when America chose to use our look, our nationality, our skin color as an identifier about who you're going to enslave, and after enslavement, who you're going to deny basic rights to, when America chose to use that as an identifier, they don't get to now come back and say, well, we use that as an identifier for who we were going to do it to, but you can't use it as an identifier for who gets reparations for what we did. That is insanity.
States from blah, 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 blah. Those who Africans, I think we can say Africans, that were put on the ships, stolen from Africa and brought here, and then enslaved. And those who are, because we are also, I know, and Cobra does, and I know others do, we are not just a reparations for people who can trace their descendancy to an enslaved African, because the injury that is caused is despite whether or not you're enslaved or not. We call it the legacies of slavery, and so those of us, like using Diallo for an example, we did that in Kichi and our Legal Strategies Commission, if you can recall. They didn't stop and ask if Diallo was a descendant of an enslaved African when they shot him 42 times in the back, or shot, I think it was in the back, but shot him 42 times. They didn't ask it. But the legacy says Black man, we'll call him African descendant now, walking down suspicious, I'm gonna shoot before I talk. Mm-hmm. That's the legacy of slavery. And so we have to be able to discuss it using their terminology, twisting it on them, but then also using ours.
Using popular legal notions of race and lineage would be inadequate in many ways, because they rely on the same field of violence that created the harm in the first place.
When you're doing a mass tort case, you have several buckets. You go in as a lawyer and you say, I'm not going to limit this to the people who were 5 minutes away from the gas leak. There were people who were right next to the gas leak, and there were people who were 5 miles away from the gas leak, but they were all impacted, right? And so even if the impact is on a sliding scale, you still include all of those people as potential recipients of some sort of reparation. You don't just say, I'm only going to include the person who lived right next door to the gas leak. That does not make sense from a legal perspective. You start broad, and then you let the judge limit you.
Now, when you talk about this legacy issue, one of the presenters talked about the genealogical proof standard. And that, I believe, adds another layer of complexity and could perhaps introduce a level of delay in dispensing reparations. And that's something that we may not intend. They named 5 things. And when you think about those 5 things, and then those who may be standing in line for reparations and all of the structures and processes that would have to be put in place, I actually couldn't figure out when we would actually get to a point where people could see real reparations. You're talking about reasonably exhaustive research, complete and accurate source citations, thorough analysis and correlation, resolution of conflicting evidence, soundly written conclusion based on the strongest evidence. That's a lot.
The lineage advocates, whom I call La, I could call another, but anyway, sound eerily like the slave catchers during enslavement who roamed the back roads of the South and stopped enslaved people from reaching their destinations unless they could produce papers written by their enslavers proving that their travel was legitimate. They also echo the infamous pass laws that were part of South Africa's way of controlling how Black folk move from one neighborhood to another. Thirdly, not only are the lineage folk advocating white legal documentation to make our people eligible for reparations, but they are also pathologically anti-Pan-African.
And the last time I checked, once you become a citizen, you're a citizen. And so what they're experiencing matters, right? There's a positive correlation between, again, duration in the US and the health of Black immigrants to the US. And again, that is based on the fact that they are experiencing the harm associated with the legacy of enslavement. Health interview survey. In at least 6 other studies, sitting here right now on my desk, for Black immigrants adopting a Black racial identity, it often leads to a downward rather than an upward mobility for them. So this notion that they are doing so much better and they came of their own accord, that needs to be interrogated. Further, I do want people to finally know I am not against, addressing the primacy of the needs of those of us who are direct descendants. I am, in fact, in favor of what the language was saying, showing special consideration. And I think that part of our job is to figure out in our future meetings what that special consideration looks like. But I don't think special consideration is the same as, and therefore deny everyone else.
African Americans with a special consideration for descendants of US slavery. In common parlance, that's very clear. African Americans, that means all Black people. And that's where you start. You start with the broad category of all Black people. And then you go to special consideration for descendants of enslaved people born in the United States. The language is clear. You don't need to go beyond the language. And that is how we should be proceeding. That is how we should be framing any motions. I think the motion is crafted in a way that is still narrower than the plain language of the statute. And I think the plain language of the statute is quite broad. And there's no reason to go narrower than the plain language. I think the plain language is African Americans, meaning all Black people, with a special consideration for descendants of U.S. slavery. And so I think Member Scott Lewis's language is still a little bit too narrow.
Government. Slavery and its continuing legacies have targeted a group because its group identity is African, African descendant, or Black. This targeting has caused significant injury. The murder of the many Black people by the police throughout the United States, the differential treatment of Black people as I've indicated above. money reparations, and only to descendants of Africans enslaved in the United States or in California, since you all can't do it for the whole United States, wish you could, is an insult to the enslaved Africans, as it diminishes the magnitude of the injury caused by enslavement. It also constricts the recipients of even those money reparations to people who can somehow prove they are descendants of enslaved Africans. What about people who look like me, who cannot meet a standard of proof that they are descended from an enslaved African? Even more concerning, what about reparations for the legacy of slavery? Money reparations do not address a key charge of the legislation to address the legacy of slavery. And in addressing the legacy, the recipient group, to have any credibility, must be larger than those who can demonstrate they are descendants of enslaved Africans. People who look like me, but are not descended from enslaved Africans, suffer the injuries of the legacies of slavery. That is the major crime of slavery and its legacies. It imprinted on people who look like me a presumption of inferiority, a presumption of criminality, a presumption of loose morals, a presumption that leads to being unable to obtain jobs and housing of the same caliber as so-called whites. Money reparations to only those who meet a burden of proof of descending from an enslaved African leaves those who are victimized by the legacy of slavery with an injury without a remedy.
Because I'm not intimidated, I'm not frightened by any of this, and I am an unavowed follower of Haj Malik el-Shabazz, who was a Pan-Africanist. I don't back up from that. I am a Pan-Africanist because Kwame Ture, also known as Stokely Carmichael, was a Pan-Africanist. And they were both immigrants. And I ain't about to deny their sons or daughters, from my position, reparations. I'm not denying Amadou Diallo. Amadou Diallo was from Guinea. Under the police terror and the war on drugs, they did not ask him whether he was from Guinea or not. Nor did that apply to our brother Abner Louima. Not about to deny Shirley Chisholm. I'm not about to deny Harry Belafonte. Today's descendant today's immigrant is next generation's African American, like the sister,
And before I transition to my next panel, I think one of the areas where there's been some criticism, I think it's important just to talk about, if you all don't mind reflecting on this, of the California program, is that some people think it should have been more broad and more inclusive. The program, you all decided to tie the eligibility for reparations to direct lineage, aka direct descendants of enslaved people. How did you all arrive at that decision, and how do you all respond to some of the criticism? I don't know that there's ever going to be 100% consensus around this sort of topic in terms of implementation and execution, but I did want to give you the opportunity, if you would, to just talk about that aspect of your work and how you arrived at that component of the task force decisions.
So I'll start. Interestingly enough, you have two members of the task force with opposing views on this issue of eligibility. I was an opposing vote. The chair was an affirmative vote. We arrived at this decision based on deliberations in the task force hearings. Although, to be frank, I don't feel that those deliberations were complete, that they were short-circuited based on some procedural issues. There was not enough dialogue across all the task force members. And so I feel like we came to a decision too quickly, even though it was formally discussed, if you will, over two task force hearings. I think that personally, I think it was an error in decision-making by the task force. And I think that some of our survey data and polling data suggests that a broader cross-section of the California general community and the African-American community actually are not soundly behind the idea of lineage-based eligibility. But here we are. I do want to say, though, that I think that those of us who had the opposing view were not against the idea of the need for and the deserving response of special consideration for direct descendants. But if we look at the letter of the legislation in AB 3121, it was about the harms that are incurred during enslavement and post-enslavement. And in that post-enslavement period of harm, it is not just direct descendants, it is all Black people in this in the state that would be in peril and who have been impacted by the many different forms of ongoing racial oppression in the state.
Panel, Dr. Carr, that you did not get a chance to mention in the 4 points that you were listed in your written testimony.
Yes, sir. Appreciate you. And, I've been toying for years at this law review article in the back of my mind entitled "No Standing for Whiteness." Whiteness has to be displaced as a matter of law. We just heard from Brother Shaw, part of the litany of abuses. I think one of the strengths of the California report is that litany of abuses, the enumeration. I think also that there's a challenge we have. Jacob Carruthers writes about this in 1972 in a little pamphlet he called Science and Oppression. He says, when we start dealing with ordinal classifications, trying to prove the harm by this kind of competition of qualitative and quantitative, stacking, we'll never get to the underlying point. And this is what I really wanted to address in the last 2 points that I had, points 3 and 4. When I said policy level repair efforts shouldn't automatically preclude any form of remedy, and Dreesen really brought this up beautifully when she says we shouldn't suppress our radical imagination. DC, and I know you know this as a lawyer, as a scholar, and as a politician, we the amendment. There is no preclusion of race-based remedies in the original interpretation. This is all political, whether it be Powell and Backey, whether it be Senator O'Connor and Grutter and Gratz, whether it be you name it, Schuette, all the way down through Scalia, Clarence Thomas, you name it. My point is this: when I say that the federal constitution and concomitant issues of race-based remedy by changes in state constitutions, which is why California's hands are tied. These efforts should find a creative point of entry for proposed remedies by applying to district residents of African descent an overarching and at once calibrated concept that recognizes the unique circumstances that made geographically specific enslavement and global Blackness virtually coterminous, meaning Black means Black wherever you are. I don't think they're not turning down people because their last name is Oyewumi somewhere for right, The original harm of enslavement was carried out against African people in policies that predate Western nation states by distinct European nation states from which the current United States descends. Reparative justice presents an opportunity to imagine new definitions of self-determination that can help decolonize modernity. This is a very important point. In a city where African Liberation Day was first celebrated, in a city where the anti-apartheid movement has it would be not only illogical, it would be insane to try to restrict the remedy to those who went through enslavement exclusively here. And I think this is the opportunity to force that conversation to the federal legislature, and only DC can do it.
Reparations movements than just the war on drugs. And marijuana justice, we do not believe in limiting the criteria for lineage only, and should also include a broader criteria that this council has already heard and many folks has testified to. And just want to again emphasize what Dreesen.
And we have to protect one another. 90% of us were enslaved. 90% of the Black people in this country descend from slavery. And in this moment, we have to embrace this concept that Black lives matter, not just a sliver of those Black lives, because Black lives are in danger, especially today.
But I would like to conclude and emphasize the mere focus around community-led processes, and that this process not be totally hijacked by systems of the government and enumerate the concerns within the community. If the DC bill, which it does outline post-emancipation harms as well, it should not commit the same mistakes that California has done in limiting then the harmed community via law for which the remedies will be distributed.
Panelists, one of the things I think is important for you and the council to consider as you deliberate on this bill is that you don't want to also embed within the process of divisiveness. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's what happened. I testified several times on the California bill. I know the people that lined up. I know the way in which it was orchestrated to have those who are embracing lineage be at the front of the line. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that there is not some legitimate discussion, which I've talked with at least my sister here, Nkechi, about what role lineage plays. But if we are truly going to repair the injustices and the brutality and the criminality of slavery and its legacy, we must have a plan that is broader than lineage. Okay. And so that was what I wanted to share. And thank you very much again.
Because I testified immediately after Dean Chemerinsky. And as Attorney Moore said, I don't know, people who might not be lawyers may not have caught that. Erwin Chemerinsky said, if you got to choose between lineage and race, I choose lineage. And Attorney Moore said that. I testified after him and they said, what would you recommend? I said, if you got to choose between lineage and race, I choose lineage. People interpreted that and said, I support lineage. No, because guess what? As you know well, the courts are going to use lineage as a proxy for race. Right. It's not going to save you. Anyway, I'll stop with that.
For Black oppression and repression. Ultimately, what we need is a transformation of American society and culture writ large. The grounding ethos for this reconstructed American society must be the all-encompassing pursuit of the question, how can we best ensure that all Black people are thriving? And I raise this issue as a caution against basing the success of the reparations program on funds conveyed, apologies given, or monuments erected. The success of any reparations regime has to be grounded in the substantive and lasting material, social, psychological, and spiritual lived experiences for all Black people, and in this case, all Black DC residents. Thank you.
We argue that all people within the Black diaspora should receive reparations equivalent to the amount of wealth generated as a result of slavery, as well as what was lost as a result of racial discrimination like Jim Crow. Reparations should also consist of a true and formal apology and economic rehabilitation programs. And the task force should consist of those within the Black diaspora and employ a transparent process, which includes the larger harmed community. Thank you.
And thank you.
Let us not take a narrow and divisive approach. Let us start with an all Black people and then prioritize. We have descendants right here in California from Allensworth. What if they can't prove their lineage? What do we do about them? I think that we need to start with all Black people who have been harmed by America, in America, should be repaired by and in America. It's a understandable approach. And more importantly, I don't want to get into very narrowly defined approaches. We have seen what that narrow approach has done in our community. We have seen the impact of some of us versus the rest of us. Rather than take that very narrow and unsustainable approach, let's start with all of us and then prioritize, move to how we can accommodate, support, and include all of us, because all of us have been harmed in one way or another.
I am director of the Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. It is not surprising that the issue of eligibility has emerged in the California Task Force on Reparations, since certain groups have been aggressive in ringing the phones, flooding the emails, and pounding the doors of commissioners about the non-eligibility of African people in the diaspora. These groups are backed by conservative, right-wing, anti-immigration groups that are opposed to any immigrant receiving any reparations for the transatlantic slave trade. Just yesterday, I testified before the Boston City Council, and this poisonous and uninformed philosophy was offered as a justification for excluding non-American Africans born in the Caribbean and South America. The global reparations struggle has always been international, with various Africans cooperating from different countries. I have been a part of these meetings on reparations in Scotland, Barbados, England, and South Africa. And what all these groups have in common is the goal of obtaining reparations for the descendants of those enslaved during the transatlantic slave trade. The answer to the question, should reparations be only for descendants of people enslaved in the United States, or should reparations be extended to any Black person in the state, should be the latter group. All Black people in California should receive reparations, since they were judged by the color of their skin rather than what passport or nationality they had. The women that were sterilized by this state because they were Black, the land that was taken illegally by the state because the owners were Black, were never asked what country they were from. Indeed, 95% of those Africans in the Western Hemisphere, from Brazil to Brooklyn and from Curacao to California, have enslaved people in their family's history. I urge the task force to not only grant reparations to all Black people living in the state of California, but to do an investigation of those groups opposing this and the financial backers of them. Thank you.
Task Force Cam Howell within COBRA. It is my understanding that the question presented here on eligibility is one that wants to ensure that those people most injured by the racist anti-African crimes are ensured repair. One notion is that only Blacks who can prove enslavement ancestry in America should be eligible. We reject this position for several reasons. First, this would in fact have a limiting effect on those who actually are descendants of Africans enslaved in the United States. Most experts looking at this issue would agree that a large portion of this group would not be able to prove ancestry in a timely fashion, if at all, rendering them ineligible for repair.
I am a legal expert that knows that it is constitutional to develop a reparations proposal or an reparations plan that is based on race and injury. That is the Japanese American Restitution Bill. I am pained by the separatist and chauvinistic views of those who seek to defocus reparations from full repair and push a narrow view that will not repair, but only provide money for the small group of those who can prove descendancy from enslaved Africans.
Immigrants, whether they came during the early 1900s or they came in 2000, are going to should be excluded, even though AB 3121 says that we should be looking at the harms done from the legacy of enslavement, not just the period of enslavement. And so if that be the case, what is it that these African and Caribbean immigrants are going to take away from the direct descendants? I'm not understanding that. It's like, are people assuming that there's this finite pot of money, and that if there's $100 in the pot of money, then that has to be divided. That can only be divided among the descendants, because if it's divided among all who are harmed, everybody's going to get a smaller amount. We haven't had that conversation yet, but there's an awful lot of concern about detracting from descendants if we embrace immigrants, African descended immigrants. So I'm thinking is troubling for me. And so my question is, how do I get out of that box and say, can we in fact ask the economists to do two scenarios and let's compare them, right? They can just change, I think it would be they would change the denominator in the equation. and say, what would the reparations, monies look like with just direct descendants using a lineage base? And what would it look like if we didn't limit it to lineage base, but we limited it to, we anchored it around harms, right? So, and that we do our work and bring in some folks that can help us understand the consequences of the lineage issue.
And as you explained, if you are from Africa and you immigrated to the United States at some point, you can still go back, and that's still your home. My question is specifically around the fact that slavery was a hemispheric economy, very much in the Western Hemisphere, where Black people were being traded through all of the Americas, through the Caribbean, into the United States, back and forth, just a commodity. And those folks from the Caribbean and from other parts of the hemisphere who were enslaved have the same disconnection from their past, from their roots, as those of us enslaved in the United States. And many of us have now come together, all of us with that disconnected, with that disconnected ancestry, regardless of what part of the Western Hemisphere we're from, whether we're from the Caribbean or from the States. And this is not just a problem that all Black people face in policing. It's a problem that anyone with Black skin faces at every moment, every point in time, every moment of their being in this country. When you go into the hospital, when you apply for a loan to try and get a mortgage, when you try to get an appraisal, people are focused on your Black skin, not necessarily your lineage. That is the harm that we are facing today. So with that, I will say that I recognize the importance of the language of the bill and the special consideration language. I value that. I value Dr. Weber's vision, and I do think that we should have a tiered policy, and we should have a tiered eligibility criteria that starts with descendants of slaves born in the United States. But we also have to embrace what is happening to our Black family now. We can't start disaggregating to the point where we split apart. We split apart into a million pieces that has no real power or real momentum.
I don't think you just have to do something that is the lineage from descendants of enslaved Africans. I think you can do both. I think we see models of that in many ways. We see it even though, we realize that we can't have a remedy that pulls out only only Black people or Black Americans when the injuries are general to everybody.
Because I'm not intimidated, I'm not frightened by any of this. And I am an unavowed follower of Haj Malik el-Shabazz, who was a Pan-Africanist. I don't back up from that. I am a Pan-Africanist because Kwame Ture, also known as Stokely Carmichael, was a Pan-Africanist. And they were both immigrants. And I ain't about to deny their sons or daughters, from my position, reparations. I'm not denying Amadou Diallo. Amadou Diallo was from Guinea. Under the police terror and the war on drugs, they did not ask him whether he was from Guinea or not. Nor did that apply to our brother Abner Louima. Not about to deny Shirley Chisholm. I'm not about to deny Harry Belafonte. Today's descendant today's immigrant is next generation's African American, like the sister,
Ladies and gentlemen,
this is an example.